back to the Insurance versus History podcast. I'm Meredith Brasher, and I'm excited to dive into more episodes where I examine how insurance has changed history. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in history, and for 20 years I worked in the insurance industry, underwriting liability exposures for everything from paranormal investigators to the world's top 500 companies. Do you want to know how history happened? Insurance can help. Welcome back, everyone. I know it's been a while. As topics get more complicated, episodes take longer. But there are ways to support the podcast so I can produce content more regularly. First, you can hire me to come talk to your organization about insurance and insurance history. Second, you can contribute to the show costs by tipping me at www.buymeacoffee.com/insurancevshistory. Links are in the show notes. Third, you can leave me a review on your podcast player of choice. It all helps. This is the second episode in a 3-part series about slavery and insurance. The first episode was about how insurance enabled the Atlantic slave trade. Today, I'm talking about the British Abolition movement and how a gruesome insurance dispute offered a unique opportunity to bring the reality of slavery to the British masses. This story is about early insurance litigation and how a legal case that got very little initial attention became a rallying cry for the abolition movement. Trigger warnings, obviously. What I'm going to talk about is horrible and horrifying, and you should be aware of this and act accordingly. But this is an important story to tell, and it's a story I'm guessing you don't know or you don't know very well. And you probably don't know how it continues to affect us even today. A couple of things before I get started. First, I should clarify that in the US and the UK, we use different terminology when referring to the fight to end chattel slavery. In the UK, the term abolition refers to the movement to end the Atlantic slave trade, not slavery as a whole. Emancipation refers specifically to the campaign to free enslaved people. In the U.S., we often use the words abolition and emancipation interchangeably. When I refer to abolition in this episode, I'm referring to the movement to end the British slave trade, not the movement to end slavery in the British colonies, which were two different movements separated by more than 30 years. Second, it makes sense to recap the history of British involvement in slavery up to the 1770s, when our abolition story begins. When the Atlantic slave trade began in the 15th century, it was primarily driven by Spain and Portugal. England was involved as early as 1562, when ship captain and pirate wannabe John Hawkins got permission from Queen Elizabeth to obtain and sell slaves in the West Indies. Before the early 18th century, British slave trade operations were carried out by a seemingly ever-changing group of royal monopolies. However, it is important to remember that, despite these seeming monopolies, illegal slave trading by British citizens happened quite commonly during this time. After the slave trade opened up to British merchants in the late 17th century, British involvement in the slave trade increased exponentially. England became the leader in the Atlantic slave trade, transporting about 40% of all enslaved people between the 17th and 19th centuries. The slave trade was also a boon for British cities like Liverpool and Bristol. These two cities were powerhouses of the slave trade. Not only were they the places where slaving voyages typically started, but they also were the cities that built slaving ships, processed slave-grown crops from raw to finished products, and financed, and often insured, all of it. Up to that point, the only public conversation, albeit very minor, about slavery and the humanity of the slave trade in Britain was the assertion by the Royal African Company in the late 17th century, that was the monopoly in place before the opening up of the trade, that allowed merchants to conduct slave trading would lead to worse conditions for enslaved people. Not only did this discussion go nowhere, but there was the fact that the Royal African Company wasn't exactly humane by any stretch of the imagination. Perhaps that is part of why the abolition movement didn't start in Britain. It actually started in the American colonies, which is interesting since the U.S. was one of the last places in the world to eliminate chattel slavery. While most of us think of slavery in the U.S. as a Southern phenomenon, slavery existed all over the American colonies before the Revolutionary War, though admittedly the North did not have the numbers the South could claim. For example, if you've listened to my first episode on the gangs of New York, you'll remember the first female firefighter in New York was an enslaved woman named Molly Williams in 1818. The total abolition of slavery in New York didn't happen until 1827. The movement to eliminate chattel slavery started with Quakers living in the American colonies. Quakers were not always anti-slavery, quite the opposite. In 1705, nearly 70% of Quakers in the colonies owned slaves. And by colonies here, I mean the U.S. colonies, but also the colonies in the West Indies. In contrast, Quakers living in England generally did not own slaves, and they as a group had little social capital and were subject to significant government persecution. Quakers who had immigrated to the American colonies, however, became important members of society and, in many cases, successful merchants, business owners, and politicians. As early as the 1660s, Quakers living in the American colonies started to talk about slavery and whether or not it was in line with their religious beliefs, but it wasn't until the 1770s that slavery became anathema to the religion. In 1774, the Society of Friends gave Quakers around the world an ultimatum: emancipate their slaves by 1776 or leave the society entirely. At the same time, some people outside the Quaker faith were starting to talk about abolition as well. It's worth touching on some of those people. Two of the most important were Granville Sharp, a low-level government clerk and amateur lawyer who advocated for the enslaved and freed black people in England, and Olaudah Equiano, a freed slave living in London. Equiano was enslaved in Africa at age 11 and traveled all around the world, first as a slave and then as a freedman, before ending up in London and joining like-minded abolitionists and writing a best-selling memoir. I should mention that there is some academic debate as to whether Equiano told the truth about his origins in Africa. At least one current scholar argues Equiano was born in North Carolina, but this issue is not yet settled. William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament, would also become quite important later on as he repeatedly introduced bills for abolition. There were many other important abolitionists, including women and other people of color, but these are the three most important to my discussion today. Granville Sharp, the government clerk turned amateur lawyer, attacked slavery through the court system. The first case Sharp brought to the courts was in 1767. Jonathan Strong, an enslaved 15-year-old brought to England from Barbados, had been severely beaten by his owner, David Lyle, and then abandoned. Granville Sharp's brother had a free medical clinic in London, and Granville saw Jonathan Strong waiting in line to be treated. As Jonathan Strong recounted, and I will repeat exactly what he wrote, quote, "I could hardly walk or see my way where I was going. When I came to him and he saw me in that condition, the gentleman take charity of me and gave me some stuff to wash my eyes with and some money to get myself a little necessaries till the next day. The day after, I come to the gentleman and he sent me to hospital, and I was there 4 months and a half. All the while I was in the hospital, the gentleman find me clothes, shoes, and stockings, and when I come out, he paid for my lodgings and money to find myself some necessaries till he gets me into a place." Unquote. Strong worked for several years in London at a job Sharp helped him obtain. One day, David Lyle spotted him and decided to recapture the teen and sell him to a West Indies planter. Sharp took up the case, though Lyle threatened him with a duel. Sharp's response: he would get satisfaction from the law. From what I've read, Sharp loved to argue, and while he was deeply religious, he seemed like the kind of guy who was wonderful in very small doses. From all accounts, he was a lot. The legal status of Jonathan Strong and the legality of Lyle's kidnapping raised a lot of questions. Sharp started digging into the law, and what he found made him determined to study the law and fight for the rights of enslaved people. Granville was eventually able to keep Strong from being sold and deported, though the case itself never really addressed the issue of slavery. Strong died soon after, likely as a result of damage from that beating years ago, unable to enjoy his newfound freedom for long. It is important to note that Granville Sharp was an amateur lawyer. He did not appear in court except as an observer, but he was deeply involved in the strategy and execution of many court cases involving slavery brought before the courts. After bringing to court two more cases, Hylas v. Newton and Rex v. Stapleton, Sharp was getting a sense of how the English courts were handling slavery-related cases, and in particular, how Lord Mansfield, Chief Justice of the King's Bench, was agitating them. I've mentioned Mansfield before, but just to recap. William Murray, Lord Mansfield, was a lawyer turned politician turned Chief Justice of the King's Bench. He is perhaps one of the most important legal figures in Western law, and his tenure as Chief Justice over more than 30 years changed English law and deeply affected American law. While I would consider him progressive for the time, though he was very royalist and pro-commerce in his rulings, he never expressed anything publicly as to whether he supported or opposed slavery. In fact, as a judge, Mansfield would do just about anything to avoid ruling on the legality of slavery, to the point that it's almost amusing. I wouldn't have characterized Mansfield as wishy-washy or uncertain of his feelings, so this is an important caveat to his legal career. One of the only times he spoke about the institution of slavery, and it was in regards to a specific case, he said, and I warn you, there is some dated and questionable language here, quote, "I hope it never will be finally discussed. For I would have all masters think they were free and all Negroes think they were not, because then they would both behave better." Unquote. Sigh. Sharp, for his part, was canny and determined and adjusted his tactics and the cases he brought to try and force Mansfield's hand. Rex v. Stapleton's a great example. Thomas Lewis was an enslaved man owned by a Mr. Stapleton. At some point, they were traveling by ship when the vessel was captured by Spanish privateers. The privateers freed Lewis, and he returned to America as a free man. Years later, he moved to England, where Stapleton spotted him in 1771, kidnapped him, and put him on a ship to be sold in Jamaica. Sharp used the same tactic he had developed when he saved Jonathan Strong from being expatriated to Jamaica. He asked the court for a writ of habeas corpus. This was a legal maneuver created in 1758 that ostensibly prevents wrongful incarceration. Since the writ required that the person being held, Thomas Lewis in this case, appear before the High Court in person, it effectively got him off the ship where he was being imprisoned and in danger of being shipped and sold, and into the custody of the King's Bench, which was a much safer place to be. Stapleton also had to appear in court with an explanation as to why Lewis was being detained. Mansfield, for his part, tried to wriggle out of a ruling here. Like many cases at the Court of King's Bench, this one went to a jury for deliberation. Don't think that that was like our juries today. First, it was definitely not a jury of Thomas Lewis's peers, and second, it was pretty normal for a judge to tell the jury exactly how to rule, and for the jury to basically do that. When Mansfield sent it to the jury, he was very clear with them that this was not an issue of whether slavery was legal in England. It was an issue of whether or not the, quote, chain of ownership, unquote, was broken when the Spanish privateers took ownership of Lewis and then freed him. As a result of this broken chain, the jury said that Stapleton did not own Lewis, and therefore Lewis was freed. While this was great news for Thomas Lewis, Granville Sharp was aggravated that Mansfield would not rule on the issue of slavery. The next year, in 1772, Sharp took on a case called Somerset v. Stewart. James Somerset was a slave in his 20s who had been brought to England by his owner, Charles Stewart, a customs officer from Virginia. During his 2 years in England, Somerset was baptized a Christian and became involved in the abolitionist movement. Somerset escaped from Stuart in 1771, but was recaptured, at which point Stuart put Somerset on a ship with a plan to sell him in Jamaica. This should start to feel very familiar to everyone. Sharp saw this as another opportunity to get Mansfield to rule on slavery in England. First, he started with the writ of habeas corpus again for the same reasons he'd used prior, to get Somerset off that slaving ship and into the custody of the Court of King's Bench. This time there was no chain of ownership for Mansfield to use as an out. Somerset's lawyers argued that his recapture and confinement were illegal under English law. It was clearly legal under Virginia law, and that, quote, "No man at this day is or can be a slave in England," unquote. Given Mansfield's general anti-colonial bent when he was a politician, it is safe to say Mansfield's political legacy is part of the reason we had a revolution in America. It was pretty smart of Sharp and the lawyers to put forward a case involving colonial law versus English law. They wanted Mansfield to apply English law rather than Virginia law. The goal, obviously, was to get Mansfield to rule that slavery in England itself was illegal. Stuart's lawyers argued that if Somerset won, it would be a catastrophe. There were approximately 16,000 slaves in England at that time who would demand freedom. The West Indian plantations would be in chaos, that kind of thing. Mansfield did not want to rule on this issue, and he tried to avoid it in a bunch of different ways. First, he postponed the hearing several times. Second, he tried to get the two sides to settle out of court. Then, he asked the abolitionists why they couldn't just buy Somerset and then free him and solve the issue that way. Then he suggested to Charles Stuart he should just free Somerset, and he suggested this several times. But neither side wanted to settle. Somerset's lawyers wanted Mansfield to rule on slavery, and Stuart's lawyers, supported by the West Indian plantation owners, wanted Mansfield to rule on slavery. They were just kind of hoping for different rulings. After about 6 months of Mansfield-initiated postponements, both sides went to court, where Mansfield was irritated by the applause and interjections from the viewing gallery every time Somerset's lawyers made a great point. And they made a lot of great points. Sharp, for his part, realized his attendance at court would probably irritate Mansfield more and stayed away. The newspapers covered the trial in detail, including the verdict. Mansfield, for his part, said the case wasn't about the legality of the slave trade. It was about that writ of habeas corpus and whether or not Somerset could be held in captivity and taken out of the country against his will. Slavery was against Somerset's will too, but that wasn't brought up by Mansfield, of course. Finally, he could avoid it no further. On June 22, 1772, Mansfield and the 2 other judges adjudicating the case, there was no jury this time, ruled. Mansfield said that English law regarding habeas corpus applied, and as a result, Somerset was basically freed from his enslavement. While some people believed that this action ended slavery in England, the ruling was fairly narrow and it did not effectively end slavery. In his ruling, Mansfield clarified that, and I should caution we've got some icky language again. Quote, "The power of a master over his slave has been extremely different in different countries. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only on positive law, which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasions, and time itself from whence it was created is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences, therefore, may follow from this decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged." Unquote. I kind of want to highlight the phrase positive law, as I think it's really important. Mansfield was saying that England had no law on the books, no royal edict, nothing that specifically said slavery is legal in England. So, in essence, there was nothing in the law that specifically said that slavery was legal or illegal. It was a loophole that Mansfield knew was going to cause issues, but not a loophole that had enough political will to be solved in the current parliament. The West Indian planters had tried in the past and failed. While Somerset was free, and some people believed the ruling had ended slavery in England, practically it did little. Enslaved people were still bought and sold in England. But when Alauda Equiano approached Granville Sharp about a court case that had just been decided, a case involving insurance, of all things, they both saw an opportunity to not only push the legal climate further in the direction of abolition, but an opportunity to bring the horrors of the slave trade right into the homes of British citizens. The story of the slave ship Zong and the resulting insurance claim starts in Liverpool, where a man named William Gregson was preparing one of his ships, appropriately called the William, for a slave trading voyage to Africa in 1780. William Gregson was a titan in the slave trading business. He started his career as a rope maker and worked up the economic ladder by investing money in slave trading voyages. Eventually, he would become mayor of Liverpool and invest in more than 150 slave trading voyages, responsible for shipping more than 58,000 kidnapped Africans to the New World. For the ship christened the William, Gregson chose Richard Hanley as his captain, a man with 13 slave trading voyages under his belt. He also chose a surgeon named Luke Collingwood and 30 men as crew. Gregson wasn't the only investor in this voyage. Like many slave trading voyages, which were quite expensive to mount, likely in the 1.7 to 2 million pound range today, he had a syndicate, a group of investors. His sons were investors, as were two other Liverpool merchants. Because he'd been in the business a while and lost ships to storms in the past, he insured his voyage with a group of local merchants acting as underwriters. As I've spoken about before, marine insurance was well developed by the 18th century, with Lloyd's wording being the most commonly used, even outside of Lloyd's itself. And underwriters in Britain, not just Lloyd's, but all the merchant underwriters in places like Bristol and Liverpool, were insuring hundreds of millions of pounds of slave ship cargo every year. And this cargo primarily involved kidnapped people from Africa. In the case of the William, the insurance was provided by a group of merchants in Liverpool who also underwrote voyages for other people. Gregson also acted as an underwriter for other slave trading voyages he was not invested in. There were enough merchant underwriters in Liverpool to insure the voyage without needing to approach Lloyd's. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot of details on this particular insurance policy because the Williams voyage was successful. The Williams voyage started easily enough in October 1780, and when the ship reached the coast of West Africa, it anchored off the coast, as you did for a multitude of reasons rather than docking at a port, and began the slow process of buying kidnapped Africans. While the captain, Richard Hanley, was in that process, which could take up to 8 months or more, he learned that a Dutch ship called the Zorg, also anchored off the coast of West Africa, was for sale. The Zorg had been seized by the British government in February 1781 as retaliation for Dutch trading with the Americans. We're right in the middle of the American Revolution, and the British government was selling it off. The Zorg already had purchased 244 enslaved people and was close to being full and ready to depart for the West Indies. Like many trusted ship captains of the day, Richard Hanley had authority from William Gregson to purchase another slave ship if the right opportunity arose, and he had the bills of exchange from Gregson to make it happen. This was that opportunity, and the captain purchased the ship. However, most of the crew from the Dutch Zorg had run off or found other ships to work on in the meantime, so it had no captain and insufficient crew. I am assuming that the British military was on board and making sure that the 244 enslaved people trapped on the ship stayed alive, though in what condition I can only imagine. Hanley wrote to Gregson to inform him of the sale. When the letter arrived in Liverpool, Gregson then took out insurance on the Zong's voyage with an underwriting syndicate made up of other Liverpool merchants. Here's where things get a little confusing. What we know about the Zong comes from second-hand sources, as we don't have a copy of the actual insurance policy. It's not entirely agreed on by historians as to the amount of the actual policy, but they do generally agree that the ship itself was underinsured, meaning that the insurance taken out was less than the actual replacement value of the ship. This is something that underwriters generally don't want to do, so I'm not really sure why the underwriters here allowed it. They insured the ship itself for something like £2,500, which was probably 10% of the actual value of the ship. Then they insured the enslaved people at £30 a head, which reflected the expected sale price of these kidnapped people in Jamaica, rather than the amount that was paid to purchase them. This £30 per head was quite typical, but as an underwriter, and I know this is gruesome, there's really a disconnect here from an insurance standpoint. They're essentially insuring them for the difference between the cost and the profit, which is problematic, I think. In order to sail their kidnapped cargo of the Zong to the West Indies, however, Hanley had to find a crew or transfer some of his own crew over to the Zorg, now rechristened the Zong. 3 of his crew had died on the way to Africa already, and 3 were forced to join the Royal Navy when the William encountered a Navy ship while sailing to Africa. That's quite typical in this time period. Hanley managed to keep on 3 Dutch sailors originally with the Zorg and hire a few sailors hanging around unemployed on the African coast. These were not the best of sailors, but if you listen to my other podcast on the African slave trade, you'll remember that being crew on a slave ship was the worst work you could do as a sailor, so imagine the quality of people hanging out unemployed on the African coast. As a result, much of the crew came from the William. This included the surgeon Luke Collingwood, who was promoted to captain of the Zong. It wasn't uncommon for a surgeon to be promoted to captain in a time of need, but this was Collingwood's first time captaining a vessel, and this probably contributed to the poor decision-making that followed. Others who joined the Zong from the William included James Kelsall, promoted to first mate, and 19 other crew. They also took on 1 passenger, former governor of the local British-controlled fort in Africa, a Robert Stubbs, who had been terrible at his job and was slouching back to England. You might wonder why they would take on a passenger and why a passenger would want to be on a ship transporting kidnapped Africans, and that is a legitimate question. Stubbs was running away from the African fort where he'd been in charge, and not one other ship in the harbor would take him back to England. This gives you a general idea of how well liked he was. But there was one other thing. Prior to his governorship, he worked as a slave ship captain, so he knew what the ship was going to be like. And yet he boarded anyway. Originally, he was supposed to go back to England on the William. It's a bizarre decision that made some historians wonder if Richard Hanley, the captain of the William, had asked Stubbs to ride along and help new Captain Collingwood out. Hanley left instructions from Gregson that Collingwood should obtain more enslaved Africans before leaving for Jamaica, and with the William already laden with 382 enslaved Africans on board, definitely over capacity as was common, Hanley left for Jamaica. 32 of these kidnapped people on the William and Hanley died on the trip to the West Indies. The William arrived in Jamaica in May 1781. Still anchored off the coast of Africa, the captain of the Zong, the former surgeon Luke Collingwood, acquired another 196 enslaved people for the Zong, on top of the 244 that were already on board. This process took another 5 months. We know almost nothing about these captives. We have no names or any real information. And I shudder to think how long some of the kidnapped people had been on that ship. It could have been more than a year at that point. Mortality while these ships were anchored off the coast was enormous for both crew and for the African captives. It could be the most dangerous part of the voyage in terms of mortality. You may have caught my comment earlier that when Hanley purchased the Zong on behalf of Gregson, it was almost full, and if so, yes, that was an intentional comment. Most slave ships were deliberately overcrowded, but in the case of the Zong, it was exceptionally overcrowded. Just to put it in context, the average slave ship in Britain of the same size, approximately 110 tons, would carry 193 kidnapped Africans. That's in contrast to the Zong, that had 440 captives on board and 19 crew. That's more than twice as many. And the crew ratio to kidnapped people was very low. 1 crew to about every 26 enslaved people. So the Zong was already handicapped by 2 things: lack of crew to manage the ship and the floating prison they were on, and far too many, more than twice as many as expected, enslaved people crammed on board. When the Zong left the coast of Africa, it made one last stop in Sao Tome, which is an island off the coast of Africa that served as a way station for marine voyages. They took on supplies, including water, and from all accounts it appears they had obtained enough water to get them through the voyage with some overage, just in case. The Zong left Sao Tome on September 6, 1781, bound for Jamaica. They reached the Caribbean in November, and sometime on the 21st or 22nd of November, a crew member noticed that their water supply barrels were leaking. However, there was no reduction of daily water rations on the ship as a result of this discovery. On November 27th or 28th, they saw Jamaica, but according to later testimony, they thought it was the island of Saint Domingue, which at that time was controlled by France and Spain, both countries actively at war with the British. They sailed away from it. By the time they realized their mistake, that it was Jamaica, not Saint Domingue, they were about 120 miles off course. And here's where things start to go sideways. And if I was going to give you a trigger warning, it would be for the next sections here. We still don't know why the captain, Luke Collingwood, screwed it up this badly. On the one hand, he was a surgeon captaining his first ship, but the crew was experienced, most having come from the William. The first mate, James Kelsall, who would often have been responsible for navigation, had been demoted on the voyage at some point, but was reinstated when they entered the Caribbean. One thing we do know is that Collingwood was ill, as was much of the ship. Dysentery, a common and deadly disease on sailing ships, had taken hold. We don't know exactly what Collingwood had, but given the outbreak of dysentery, it's not impossible that he had the same affliction. Already, 60 enslaved people and 7 crew members had died. Again, they were only sailing originally with 19 crew members, and now they were down to 12. The rest of the remaining enslaved people were not in particularly good health either, and likely the crew wasn't doing much better. Richard Stubbs, the former slave ship captain and passenger, was apparently still in good health, so what the heck? I would really like to think that it was an accident or a misunderstanding that caused them to veer off course and mistake Jamaica for someplace else, but given what was about to happen, it is not beyond reason that the captain missed Jamaica on purpose. On November 29th, there was no land in sight, and according to reports, Luke Collingwood and his officers decided that there was a drinking water shortage. There were 2 possible reasons for this. First, people with dysentery need a lot of water to recover, more water than they might normally drink. Second, there was that issue of the leaky water barrels. At this meeting, did they decide then to ration water? No. God, no. Instead, Collingwood and his crew decided the only way they were going to survive was to reduce the number of people who needed that drinking water. You might start to suspect where this is going. The fact that insurance could pay for the horrible decision they were going to make was brought up during this discussion between Collingwood and his officers. Collingwood apparently said, quote, "If the slaves died a natural death, it would be the loss of the owners of the ship, but if they were thrown alive into the sea, it would be the loss of the underwriters," unquote. There is some historical dispute on the specifics of what happened next. I've done my best, but different historians have different versions of events and slightly different timelines. They do all agree that it happened and it was horrible and a lot of people died. At 8 p.m., the same day they discussed the water shortage and the insurance, November 29th, the crew separated the 54 sickest enslaved Africans, all of whom were women and children, and threw them out the cabin windows, handcuffed, one by one. Robert Stubbs later said he could hear their screams. The next day, November 30th, the crew murdered another 43 enslaved people by throwing them overboard. One of the enslaved people thrown overboard managed to catch a rope hanging from the ship and crawl back into the vessel through an open porthole. He was lucky, because it appears they left him alone after that. On December 1st, with no land in sight, it rained. This meant the so-called water shortage was over. The crew collected enough rainwater in barrels for 11 more days. At some point, either on the 1st or after the 1st, the date is disputed, they murdered another 38 enslaved people. 10 additional enslaved people were on deck during this massacre and threw themselves overboard, committing suicide before they could be murdered. The total number of people who were murdered is still unknown. The legal case that came later settled on 132, but this number is likely an undercount. The ship finally limped into Jamaica on December 22nd and landed at a place called Black River, carrying 420 gallons of water, and sold off all the remaining enslaved Africans. The enslaved survivors of the voyage were in terrible shape. A Jamaican newspaper advertisement for the sale of the Zong's human cargo mentions only 200 enslaved people. Remember, the ship started out with 440. There were enslaved Africans who died after the massacre. It's also probable that some of the people who survived to the Black River landing were so ill as to be unsellable and may have been abandoned, or worse. The horrific actions on the Zong would probably not have garnered any attention back in England, but William Gregson, the ship owner, decided to recoup his loss through his insurance coverage. I talked about the standard marine insurance policy a lot during the African slave trade voyage episode, but even I need a refresher, so here we go. First, the wording of the marine policy generally went something like this, and still does today. Quote, "Touching the adventures and perils which we the assurers are contented to bear and do take upon us in this voyage, they are of the seas," very important, "men of war, fire, enemies, pirates, rovers, thieves, jettisons," also very important, "letters of mart and countermart, surprisals, takings at sea, arrests, restraints, and detainments of all, kings, princes, and people, of what nation, condition, of quality soever, barratry of the master and mariners, and of all other perils, losses, and misfortunes," very important, "that have or shall come to the hurt, detriment, or damage of the said goods and merchandise and ship, etc., or any part thereof," unquote. I went over all these terms in the prior episode about the Atlantic slave trade, but for the purposes of this discussion, I want to go back to 3 things. 1, perils of the sea. 2, jettisons. And 3, that wording at the end that's like a little bit extra vague. Quote, "all other perils, losses, and misfortunes that have or shall come to the hurt, detriment, or damage of the said goods and merchandise of the ship," etc., etc. What wording did Gregson believe covered the murder of enslaved people? Well, first, he tried a couple of things. Perils of the sea. Perils of the sea isn't a defined term, but generally refers to any loss that cannot be prevented by reasonable care, skill, and diligence of the people on the ship. So we're talking about damage from things like storms or hurricanes or cyclones. Throwing people off the ship in order to save water doesn't really fit here. However, because Gregson wanted the best possible odds for recovering from his insurance policy, he did state that the Zong, at some point during the voyage, became leaky and damaged, and also that due to the unexpected perils of the sea, the voyage took longer than expected. Both claims he made regarding perils of the seas resulted in there not being enough water to support the lives of the people on the ship, which, therefore, required the enslaved people to be thrown overboard. In Gregson's documents, the crew threw 150 enslaved people overboard. However, he didn't stop there. He was also counting on using the clause about jettison to make his case that the deaths of the enslaved people on the Zong were a necessary action to save the rest of the crew and enslaved cargo. Jettison is the voluntary and intentional throwing overboard some or all of the cargo or part of the vessel's equipment to lighten the ship in case of an emergency. As you might recall, in England in this period, enslaved Africans were considered cargo by marine insurers. So, as gruesome as it is, Gregson probably thought he had coverage here. What he'd have to prove is that it was an emergency that required the murder of 132 people. The cynical underwriter in me, of course, has to add that they jettisoned the enslaved Africans that were least likely to sell, aka the very sick ones, first. And finally, there was this slightly vague wording at the end of the policy, often unique to risks using the standard wording established by Lloyd's, as this policy did. Quote, all other perils, losses, and misfortunes that have come or shall come to the hurt, detriment, or damage of the said good and merchandise of ship, etc., of any part thereof, unquote. God, I loved reading that. This could include damage from the ship running aground or hitting a rock or some other natural obstacle. If the cargo was damaged because of perils of like nature, so like not fire, but smoke, not water, but ice formed by seawater, it could be covered here. I think Gregson was trying to argue that the leakage of the water barrels fit in here. I mean, this was a bit of a Hail Mary for things that didn't fit into any other category or for things that were clearly excluded under a specific category. Just based on the policy that Gregson had taken out, the 30-pound per head valuation for the enslaved Africans, he was looking at a potential payout of about 4,000 pounds. That's £500,000 today. The underwriters, not surprisingly, did not want to pay out on the policy and declined to do so. I wish I could say that they did not pay because they believed it to be murder. Sadly, this was just about money. Gregson took them to court in May 1783. And that case, Gregson v. Gilbert, ended up in the court of Lord Mansfield. Again, not a lot of notice was taken by anyone at this point. I mean, it was an insurance claim. How exciting can that be? Gregson's lawyers claimed that because the ship was unable to find Jamaica, and because they were running dangerously low on water, they had to jettison, aka murder, the enslaved Africans in order to save the rest of the crew and cargo, meaning other enslaved Africans. The only witness was the Zong's passenger, Robert Stubbs, who we already know was kind of a, well, not a very nice person, who may or may not have been assisting Collingwood in some sort of advisory capacity. No one asked him any hard questions. The captain's log, which should have documented everything, disappeared. The first mate's log also disappeared. And no mention during this hearing was made of the rain a few days after they started murdering people, or of the fact they were still murdering people after the rain had fallen. Mansfield, trying to stay as far away from the words murder or slavery, ruled that the insurers should pay. Mansfield did say that, quote, the matter left to the jury was whether it was from necessity, for they had no doubt, though it shocks one very much, that the case of slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. It is a very shocking case, unquote. Yeah, ugh. Now, immediately, there were obvious issues with this ruling, and the lawyers for the insurance syndicate didn't mention some pretty important things they could have argued. First, in regards to the idea of jettisoning, No one took it to its natural conclusion, so I will. Imagine you're in a situation where your ship is going to sink if you don't offload some weight. You've already tossed over what you can, you've cut down the mast, whatever, and the only thing left is to remove people from your ship. The situation is so dire that some people must die so that other people might live. Okay, sure. So, how do you decide who will live and who will die? One way, which had been used in the past, might be to draw lots so that everyone has an equal chance, including officers and crew. The captain and crew of the Zong didn't do that. Gregson, I imagine, would argue that they targeted the sickest people to sacrifice instead. But did they? They didn't throw any ill crew overboard, or even Collingwood, who was super sick at this point. As another later insurance court case would argue regarding the starvation of enslaved people. Did any crew starve? Was the captain's table bare? No. But as far as Mansfield and Gregson were concerned, the case was settled, and it hadn't attracted much public attention. While it is true that the case wasn't getting any attention from Granville Sharp or the other abolitionists, there were some people who brought it into the public eye. A witness to the initial trial said to the Morning Chronicle and London Advertiser, a London paper, quote, "The narrative seemed to make everyone present shudder, and I waited with some impatience, expecting that the jury by their foreman would have applied to the Court of Information how to bring the perpetrators of such a horrid deed to justice. That there should be bad men to do bad things in all large communities must be expected, but a community makes the crime general and provokes divine wrath when it suffers any member to commit flagrant acts of villainy with impunity. It is hardly possible for a state to thrive where the perpetration of such complicated guilt as the present is not only suffered to go unpunished, but is allowed to glory in the infamy and carries off the reward for it." Unquote. It was at this point, on March 19th, 1783, Lauda Equiano brought the matter to Granville Sharp's attention, and Sharp was not only horrified, he thought it was a story that the British public needed to hear. Sharp and Equiano were determined to do two things. First, to relitigate the case of the Zong in the court system, this time for murder, not insurance, and secondly, to publicize what happened on the Zong in the press to inform and inflame the public. They were helped a bit by the fact that the insurance claim on the Zong was back in Lord Mansfield's court again, as the underwriters appealed the original decision. In May 1793, the lawyers for the underwriters argued that information had been missing from the original case. Primarily, the written testimony of James Kelsall, the sometimes first mate, who stated that it rained on December 1st, allowing the crew on the Zong to collect more than enough water to complete the voyage. In addition, the underwriters' lawyers argued that the enslaved people weren't murdered because of a water shortage. They were murdered because they were not going to be in saleable condition due to the outbreak of dysentery, and that the captain and crew plotted to recoup the lost money through the insurance coverage. In short, the insurance gave them the idea to murder people. As the lawyers recounted, crew, quote, acted like men who had forgot the feelings of men, quote, and that, quote, to say that wantonly or by ignorance a captain may throw 132 lives overboard is a proposition that shocks humanity. Were the compensation to stand, it would be such an intent of fraud and oppression upon those persons least capable of protection, unquote, meaning the enslaved Africans. Particularly damning was Kelsall's statement that one enslaved man on the Zong had told him that people below deck, quote, were murmuring on account of the fate of those who had been drowned. They begged they might be suffered to live, and they would not ask for either meat or water, but could live without either till they arrived at their determined port, unquote. Mansfield and the other two judges hearing the appeal approved a new trial. Mansfield said that in regards to the rain on December 1st, that, quote, it is new to me. I did not know anything of it. It is a very uncommon case, and I think very well deserves a re-examination," unquote. Granville Sharp attended the hearing, and though he did not participate in the hearing or have any discussion with the underwriting syndicate's lawyers, he was pointed out during the trial by Gregson's lawyers, who commented that Sharp was trying to bring murder charges against the remaining crew. Unfortunately, we don't know if the insurance retrial ever happened. There are no records available to tell us if the trial was completed, if the underwriters just went ahead and paid, or if Gregson figured he didn't want publicity and he dropped the claim. In 1784, a year after the hearing that established a need for a new trial, the trail went dead. In the meantime, when Gregson's lawyers said that Sharp was trying to get murder charges filed, they weren't wrong. Sharp tried to get the British government, specifically the Admiralty, which had jurisdiction for murder on British ships, to prosecute the remaining crew members for murder. In his documentation to the Admiralty, he included a transcription from that recent appeal hearing, as well as copies of letters he had sent to politicians and important men in government. Unfortunately, the Admiralty did nothing. Though, to be honest, once the crew, many of whom were still in England, heard about Sharp's plan to pursue murder charges, they all kind of hightailed out of Britain. But Sharp and Equiano were also going to use the public interest in the case of the Zong to agitate for abolition. And this is where the story of the Zong became important. It is safe to say that it was the Zong that really lit a fire under the abolition movement. As historian James Walvin says, quote, "The violence which characterized life on the slave ships and which reached such extreme levels on the Zong had frequently been discussed in print throughout the 18th century. There was plenty of publicly available evidence about the violence and killings on British slave ships, but no one had seen it cast in such a sensational and shocking light before. The Zong legal hearings in 1783 revealed the links between the staid world of insurance and the violent world of slave ships, and in the process, the matter was transformed. The insistence of William Gregson and colleagues that they received compensation for murdered Africans shifted the entire debate from a technical decision about the law of insurance into a public discussion about the very nature of slavery itself. Before 1783, arcane matters of maritime insurance had been the preserve of specialist legal debate. Now they were thrown into full public and political view," unquote. Abolitionists used the story of the Zong in their pamphlets and speeches and broadsides, horrifying listeners and readers. And after the Zong came a flurry of slavery-related cases through Mansfield's court, many involving Sharp. I mentioned in the Atlantic slave trade episode a lawsuit called Jones v. Schmoll in 1785. This is another insurance claim, 2 years after Gilbert v. Gregson. In this case, it was partly the insurrection of enslaved Africans that had resulted in the deaths of enslaved people. Some were killed during the insurrection by the crew, but many were murdered afterwards as punishment or to set an example for the remaining enslaved people. So it wasn't a case of jettisoning, but rather a case of insurrection, which was often covered by insurance policies at this time. I go into much more detail about this in the Atlantic slave trade episode, but I do want to reiterate just how terrified slave ship owners were by the idea of insurrection, as it was an insurance coverage that had been eliminated by underwriters, but then was brought back in amended form by customer demand. Given all the ways that enslaved people died on slave ships that were not covered by insurance policies, I do think it's important to highlight the fact that insurrection was the coverage that slave ship owners fought to include. In the case of Jones v. Schmoll, the policy covered insurrection, but the question was whether or not all of the murdered enslaved people would be covered by the insurance company or just the ones killed during the insurrection. In this case, Mansfield found for the insurance company. He still, however, avoided saying anything about slavery at all. In 1787, a new group called the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed. It included Quakers and non-Quakers like Sharp and Equiano, and the goal of the organization, other than abolition, of course, was to get the word out about the horrors of the slave trade to every person in England. They published Equiano's memoirs, as well as the memoirs of another freedman, Ottobah Cugano. They recruited other free blacks in England to speak all around the country. They got William Wilberforce to take up the issue of abolition in Parliament, though he wouldn't officially join the society until 1791. Members of the society wrote articles, letters to publications, obtained letters of support from politicians or important figures, sent petitions to end slavery in Parliament, and engaged women and men at all levels of society. And many of these publications mentioned the Zong and the murder of 132 people on board. The abolition movement was the first large-scale grassroots movement, and it was assisted by the increasing literacy of British society. By 1787, the abolition movement had grown so much, and the Abolition Society had been so effective in distributing propaganda about abolition, more than 50,000 pamphlets, as well as 26,000 reports and papers, that it seemed inevitable that abolition would be passed. I should also note that while the Abolition Society gets a lot of credit for the change in public perception about the slave trade, it was not the only organization, and there were a lot of people working outside the Abolition Society and not associated with it, agitating for abolition. But in 1788, the movement for abolition hit a snag, though at the time it probably just seemed like a bump in the road. After Wilberforce approached William Pitt the Younger, the prime minister, about the slave trade, Pitt took it to King George. King George was opposed to abolition, but he did allow the issue to be put to something called the Privy Council for a hearing. The hearing would be a lot like a congressional or parliamentary investigation now. There would be witnesses, and appointed members of the Privy Council would interview them. Unfortunately, what seemed like a good idea, it really wasn't. This was like sending an issue off to committee expecting it to wither and die. The Privy Council had no power to really do anything, and in fact were generally seen as royal bootlickers. At the same time, in the House of Commons, an abolitionist MP named Sir William Dolben introduced a bill to regulate the slave trade. The bill, after a few false starts, passed in 1788 and did a couple of things. It set a limit, based on the size of the trading ship, of the number of enslaved people who could be transported on that ship. Many abolitionists saw this as a misstep, as a backhand way of saying the slave trade itself was acceptable, but it just needed to be better regulated. This wasn't Dolben's intent. He definitely was trying to do something to reduce mortality and improve the treatment of enslaved people in the absence of political will to get a true abolition bill through Parliament. Under the Dolben Act, the Zong would have been allowed to carry only 175 people, not the 440 they had on board. And from an insurance standpoint, the Dolben Act regulated the insurance that could be taken out on slaving ships going forward. The Act stated, quote, "No loss or damage shall be recoverable on account of the mortality of slaves by natural death or ill treatment, or against loss by throwing overboard of slaves on any account whatsoever," unquote. Natural death and ill treatment weren't covered by the policy even before this, but eliminating coverage for any loss as a result of murdering people by throwing them overboard made another Zong massacre uninsurable. The act also eliminated that wording at the end of the policy, that all other perils language, which was vague enough to give rise to various claims relating to the death of enslaved people. In 1789, the report of the Privy Council was released and, not surprisingly, did nothing. However, William Wilberforce used the release of that report as an opportunity to push Parliament on abolition again. The next year, in 1790, an Act of the British Parliament, that's actually what it's called, an Act of the British Parliament of 1790, replaced the Dolben Act entirely and maintained the prohibition on certain insurance clauses on slave voyages. But the cause of abolition was soon put on the back burner by many in Parliament after the French Revolution in 1789, the Haitian Revolution in 1791, and subsequent freeing of the slaves in France and French territories in 1794, and the rise of Napoleon. Sharp, for his part, never let up. Court cases kept coming up, though Mansfield had retired, without ever ruling on slavery itself. In 1796, an insurance case regarding 128 slaves who died of starvation during a voyage, the new Chief Justice, Lord Kenyon, asked whether the captain starved to death too. Not surprisingly, he was just fine. And the insurance claim was denied, setting another precedent that the, quote, deliberate killing of slaves could not be rewarded by insurance cover, unquote. It wasn't just in England that abolitionists were having a hard time. Napoleon reestablished slavery in the French Empire in 1802. You might think that that would have derailed abolition in England, but it actually did the opposite. Napoleon reestablishing slavery gave some previously British pro-slavery supporters the moral high ground against the French when they decided to change sides and support abolition instead. In 1806, the abolitionists put forward a bill called the Foreign Slave Trade Abolition Bill that appealed to this anti-French sentiment by banning the English sale of slaves to foreign countries. In 1807, a bill called the Slave Trade Abolition Bill passed the House of Commons and then went to the House of Lords, where it also passed, making January 1st, 1808, the end of the British slave trade. The House of Commons gave itself a standing ovation. I mean, so unusual, no one could remember when it had last happened, and Wilberforce cried. While the end of the slave trade in 1808 was a significant move forward to ending slavery entirely, it did not automatically follow that emancipation was the next step. Far from it. First, while legally English ships were not supposed to be transporting enslaved people, there were certainly some who did, either via smuggling or use of foreign ships, or most commonly, moving enslaved people from one island to another in the West Indies. Selling slaves between West Indian islands was still perfectly legal. The British tried to use their moral high ground, as they saw it, now that they'd abolished the slave trade, to force other countries to also abolish the slave trade by making international agreements. These agreements included wording that allowed the British to seize ships if they suspected the ships were carrying enslaved Africans from Africa. This was a bit of a boon for England, and they used any hint of the slave trade to do it, seizing something like 2,000 ships between 1808 and 1870. Of those, only a quarter had any enslaved people on board, but 150,000 people were freed as a result. But the slave trade continued internationally even without Britain's involvement. After 1807, it is estimated that about 2.8 million people were forcibly transported. It took nearly 40 years before the issue of slave emancipation became part of the common public discourse in England. And why this took so long is a subject of much historical disagreement, which continues today. A few things are not debatable. First, the movement towards total emancipation started around 1823, so almost 20 years after the end of the slave trade. Most of the original abolition movement members did participate, including William Wilberforce, though he would die before emancipation became law. Second, the period from 1831 to 1832, when emancipation was passed, was a period of increasingly violent slave revolts in the West Indies, making slavery seem less appealing. Third, parliamentary reform in the early 1830s opened up voting to a huge number of people, men, who had never been able to vote previously. Voting eligibility had not been updated since the 15th century. And the election of 1832, fueled by all these new voters, meant that the House of Commons became stacked with emancipation allies, fired up by the movement's work. When emancipation finally came in 1834, it was with two unfortunate caveats. First, enormous financial compensation, approximately 20 million pounds or 2 billion pounds in today's money for slaveholders. This was some 40% of the government's annual revenue, and at the time it was, quote, the largest transfer of wealth to individuals in history, unquote. Second, the enslaved Africans weren't immediately freed. Instead, the law established an apprenticeship system for formerly enslaved adults that looked and acted almost exactly like slavery. Enslaved people were required to complete apprenticeships of 20 years. Children under 6 were immediately freed, but their parents were still enslaved, and you can imagine what a problem that was. To the credit of the emancipation movement, they worked quite hard at reducing and eventually eliminating this apprenticeship program. It was first reduced to 7 years, then 6 years for field workers and 4 for domestic workers, and then it was finally overturned in 1838. The financial payouts never seemed to receive the same scrutiny from the abolitionists, which is unfortunate. The money was, as one historian said, a windfall, 5 times greater than the 1832 wealth of the whole British Caribbean. The English government didn't have the money for the bond, so they went to the big banking families to find someone willing to lend them the money. The Rothschild family stepped in, and this is the moment when they begin to grow into a banking dynasty. Slave owners made almost 45,000 claims on the compensation fund. And in a lot of cases, at least 4,000 cases, claims were made on the same enslaved person by multiple people. In addition, at least one grifter went through the slave registries and made entirely fraudulent claims for compensation. It's clear to me, just from reading what historians have said, that there was a tremendous amount of grift and corruption. All of this money, and none of it went to the people who had actually suffered under chattel slavery. From an insurance versus history standpoint, history wins here, I think, because while insurance on slave trading ships was legally limited in England after the Dolben Act and going forward, it wasn't in other places in Europe and in the newly formed United States. However, the insurance case of the slave ship Zong was deeply important to the abolition movement. Without insurance, the murders of 132, or in reality probably more, people on the Zong would never have become public knowledge. As historian James Walvin again says, quote, what made the cases, including the Zong, paraded through the English courts between 1765 and 1796 unusual was that they allowed the courts, the public, and the press to peer beyond the brutal details of a particular outrage and to gaze, often in amazement, at the infinitely more horrible details of the Atlantic slave system itself, unquote. Historian Jane Webster goes on to say, quote, it should be emphasized that the Zong proceedings exposed for the first time the problems that human cargoes posed for insurers. Within just 2 years of the Zong trials of 1783, the status of slaves in transit was explored in a flurry of insurance litigation disputes. Slave ship insurance cases forced to the surface the issue of the humanity and agency of slaves. Every time counsel mentioned murder in the Zong case, for example, every time it was acknowledged that human cargoes could attempt to seize control of a ship, personhood was implied in court, undermining the legal status of slaves as cargo, unquote. Many of the people involved in both sides of the abolition debate left long legacies. William Wilberforce gave up his seat in the Commons in 1825, though he remained active in the anti-slavery movement and sometimes spoke in Parliament, and he died in 1833. He was important to the passing of the Slave Trade Abolition Bill, that much is true, though some of his other political positions were a bit more problematic, especially his advocacy of Christian conversion in India. His sons set about mythologizing him by whitewashing his life and denigrating other abolitionists to mere assistants of his cause. A few years ago, a movie on Wilberforce's life, or at least part of it, was released. It's called Amazing Grace, and it stars Ewan Gruffudd as William Wilberforce, and it is not terribly accurate. However, it does have Benedict Cumberbatch as William Pitt the Younger, which is an interesting casting choice given that Cumberbatch's family has close ties with slaveholding. Granville Sharp continued to fight the good fight in the court system until his death in 1813, so he at least got to see the success of the slave trade abolition movement. Like all abolitionists, He wasn't perfect, but he would probably love to argue about it with you. Olaudah Equiano didn't see the Atlantic slave trade end as he died in 1797. His memoir was a bestseller and was considered one of the first slave narratives. I've read it, and I can totally recommend it. Equiano is considered the best-known 18th century Black person in Britain, and he was even commemorated on a postage stamp in 2007. Chief Justice Lord Mansfield, who will certainly be getting his own episode at one point, never publicly stated his personal position on slavery, but his legal rulings on both slavery and insurance had great impact, both on the abolition emancipation movement and on insurance, even today. He never spoke about the Zong outside of the legal documents involved in the case. He is considered the founder of modern commercial law, a title he deserves. His introduction of Roman, foreign, and international law into the English common law was essential in bringing the English common law into the modern age. He died in March 1793 at age 88, after serving 32 years as Chief Justice. The Zong wasn't retired after its disastrous trip to Jamaica. It came back to Liverpool and was renamed the George, and it made one more slaving trip to Africa in 1784. In 2007, as part of the 200th anniversary of slave trade abolition, a memorial was laid in Black River, Jamaica for those who died and those who survived. There doesn't seem to be any record of what happened to the descendants of those who survived the passage, but I suspect and hope at some point Jamaican historians will connect the dots. It is a continuing tragedy of this story that the people on the Zong, who had families and histories and deserved so much better, cannot be identified. William Gregson, the owner of the Zong, died in 1800 before the end of the slave trade. His sons, who had already been doing quite a bit of slave trading on their own, took over his business. The Gregson family has the legacy of being one of the biggest slave trading families in English history. We don't know what happened to many of the others involved in the fateful voyage of the Zong, and the Gregson family's history seems to have faded away. And one more thing. It wasn't until 2015 that the British government considered the bond that compensated slaveholders completely paid off. The gruesome fact is that there were people in Britain paying off the debt in 2015 who were descendants of slaves, and possibly even people who may have been related to the enslaved people who survived the Zong, since many people from Jamaica immigrated to England after World War II. In my next episode about the slave trade, I will discuss how U.S. life insurance companies made a fortune selling life insurance on enslaved people, and how some enslaved people were able to use that same system of life insurance to keep their families together and even free family members from slavery. But first, we're talking about the founder of modern Lloyd's, Cuthbert Heath. Thanks for listening. Show notes, a list of sources, and additional reading suggestions can be found on my website, which is linked in the show description on your podcast player. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to the show on your preferred platform to be notified of new episodes as soon as they drop. And let other people know about the podcast by spreading the word. My social media is linked in the show description in your podcast player as well, so give me a shout. And remember, be safe, be smart, and read your policy wording.